On March 15, 2010, a man woke up in his motel room in Memphis, Tennessee, disturbed by a strange odor coming from somewhere within his room. Now, this was the third time that this has happened, and so he decided to walk over to reception and demanded that the staff go investigate. And so the manager with one of the maids walked over to room 222, and when the maid finally got onto her knees and looked under the bed, she found what no one should ever have to see. And soon enough, this discovery would make the headlines around the world. It was January of 2010, and a woman named Sony Millbrook was standing in her small bedroom getting her kids ready for the day. Sony, who was a 28-year-old woman, was already devoted a mother to 5. Her youngest was just a couple of months old, while the oldest was already attending school, and so Sony's days were generally very busy. Even though Sony wanted a better life for her and her kids, recently their home situations was not the smoothest. Less than a week ago, they had to take a shelter at the Budget Lodge Inn Motel in Memphis, Tennessee, and so their life was a little upside down at the moment. But to Sony, who was always an optimist and tried to make the best out of every situation, the most important thing was that her family had a roof over their heads for now. Sony also knew that this was only going to be temporary anyway, because she was studying hard to become a nurse so that her kids could have a better life and future. Everyone who knew Sony said that she was exceedingly smart and with her contagious laugh would make anyone's day better. But above any of all of this, she absolutely adored her 5 kids and wished for nothing more than to provide a better life and safe future for them. But all of this had one little snag. Sony was in a very complicated relationship with a father over 4 children, Lakeith Moody, and Moody, who was 6 years older than Sony, had a quite short temper and would always find himself in one argument or another. Sony and Moody's relationship was very much on again, off again for some time now, and they would be constantly bickering and arguing into early hours. In fact, when the family moved into the hotel, the first thing the neighbors heard was Sony and Moody shouting at each other well into the night. They called the motel manager to sort the noise out, but from then on, it was pretty clear that this situation was not going to be easy to manage going forward. And soon enough, for Sony and her kids, their life yet again got into a state of routine. And in the morning, Sony would get the kids ready for school and preschool, and then she would go on to college she recently enrolled in to become a nurse. And after her classes were finished, she would pick her kids up and then spend the rest of the day with them. Moody would sort of come in and out of their life, and he was not always present there to help Sony, but the family sort of gotten used to that by now. And so Sony gave a little sigh as this was yet another morning when Moody was just not there to help her, and continued on to get everyone ready for the day. A few days later, on the 27th of January, Sony was yet again getting her kids ready for school. She packed them a small lunch to take with them, but it was not much. Her bank account was almost emptied, and her benefit payment would not come in for another 5 days. So for the time being, she had to be really careful with money. But looking at her kids running around the room and getting excited about the day cheered her really up. She then looked at her watch and realized that they were actually running a little bit late, and so she hurried everyone out of the room into her car and quickly drove off. Sony managed to drop everyone off just in time, and so waving at her children goodbye, Sony put her car into reverse and started driving off into her campus to get on with her day and her classes. Later that day, Sony's children were waiting on their mom to come and pick them up. Sony was rarely late, and so the staff of the daycare began to really worry. They tried calling Sony several times, but nobody was picking up. When it was getting very late and there was still no sign of Sony, they decided to contact Sony's family to see if someone else could take the children home for the night. And so just in a few more minutes, Sony's sister Linda and Linda's husband Kermit James came to pick the kids up and take them to their place. Everyone that knew Sony were getting extremely worried. Sony has never left her kids stranded like this before. They all knew that she was going through some rough time at the moment, but even if she needed a little bit of a break from all of this, they were sure that she would have let them know and arranged something for the kids, instead of leaving them like this. Linda went by the motel to see if Sony or Lakeith were there, but there was no answer. The motel manager refused her entry, and so Linda had to leave without any answers. Having no information about his sister, Linda decided to contact the police. The room 222 was left vacant for days, and when the rent was finally up and no payment was made, the manager decided to put all of Sony's belongings into a storage. And the room was then cleaned and rented out to other guests. But there was still no sign of Sony. Her children were still being looked after by Linda and Kermit, and Linda tried going back to work herself, but found it quite difficult to balance her new duties with her work, and so the family had to make do with just one income. But the family was very tight-knit, and there was no way Sony's kids were not going to stay with Linda, even if the finances were extremely tight as a result of this. But the uncertainty of where Sony could have been was leaving everyone stressed and baffled. According to Linda's own son, it was quite regular for him to be hearing the children crying in the background whenever he was on the phone to his mom, and he confessed that the situation was just very tense for everyone involved. Sonny's room at the Lodge Inn was also investigated by the police, but with all of her belongings now gone, there was just not much they could really do in there. There seemed to be no evidence to suggest that foul play took place there, and so to everyone it looked like Sonny, as well as Lakeith, just took off and did not tell anyone about their plans or whereabouts. But this just did not sit well with Sonny's family. They knew that Lakeith was very unreliable, and it was no secret that he and Sonny had actually a very rocky relationship, so nobody was really missing Lakeith. But this was very different for Sonny. She was a beloved member of the family and everyone spoke very highly of her. She worked extremely hard so that she could carve a better life for herself and the kids, so it just made no sense for her to just disappear like that. She stopped going to her classes as well, and there was just no trace of her anywhere, and so her family knew that there must have been something wrong. The biggest obstacle the family actually came across was the police. It seemed that there was no urgency in progressing Sonny's case. They did briefly visit the budget lodge inn, but they didn't really walk out with any evidence since the room had been cleaned out. And with no information about Sonny, there was really not much the police could go on, and so their focus shifted on other cases that were actually supported by evidence. To the police, it looked like Sonny just walked away and that was the end of the story. However, this all soon would change. On March 15, so 47 days after Sonny's disappearance, the manager of the Budget Lodge Inn motel was dealing with yet another complaint about room 222. By now, the man just stopped counting how many times people noticed this strange smell coming from the room, or how many times they had to be relocated to another room because of that. The manager cited and called one of the motel maids to come along with him to investigate room 222 yet again. The manager opened the door with the key the guest had given him, and with the maid right behind him walked in. And as they crossed the threshold, they immediately were hit with this very off-putting sweet smell. Now the pair looked at each other and agreed that this is definitely the worst it has been. I mean, they have been in this room before since they received so many complaints about it recently. But they never found anything inside the room that could tell them where this odor was coming from. The manager thought that maybe a rat or a raccoon got wedged somewhere in the pipes and then died in there, and that is exactly what was causing the smell. But as much as they looked behind all the furniture and even in the AC unit, there was just nothing. Feeling lost and defeated by not finding anything in the room again, even though they could clearly smell there was something going on in there, the manager and the maid headed for the door to go back into reception. But then the maid stopped and thought for a second. She walked over to the bed where the smell was the strongest, kneeled down on her hands and knees, and lifted the bed's comforter. And as soon as she did, her eyes grew wider and wider and she began screaming. The manager ran over to her to have a look at the reason why she was behaving like that, and when he too looked underneath the bed, he was completely frozen in his motion. He just couldn't believe what he was looking at, but at the same time, he now knew what was wrong with room 222. The manager nudged the maid to get up, and they both ran back into reception, where they immediately called the police. 2 officers were dispatched, and soon enough, a crime scene tape was being stretched right in front of room 222. When the officers went inside of the room, they could too smell that something was very off in there. But of course, they expected that, as they had been told over the phone what was actually hidden inside of the room. The officers braced themselves and looked underneath the bed, and they too were completely stunned by what they were looking at. There, in the bed's steel frame, was a human body, and it was very obvious that the body was in a very bad state of decomposition, hence the smell. Backup and coroner were called in, and the whole motel went into a complete state of frenzy. This all sounded so bizarre and unbelievable, almost like it was a scene from a horror movie. The authorities managed to remove the body and send it into the medical examiner's lab for further analysis. But the coroner was able to determine 2 things. 1, that the body had been there for approximately a month and a half, and 2, that the deceased person was a woman. Suddenly, a lot of the missing puzzle pieces looked like they might start falling into their places. But before anyone could jump into conclusions, they needed a solid proof. And at that moment, nobody was able to identify the woman because of the state of decomposition she was in. So they had to wait for the full autopsy results anyway. When that was completed, the officers knew that they no longer had a missing persons case on their hands, but that they were now dealing with a homicide case, because the deceased body was indeed of Sony Millbrook, who went missing at the end of January. When Sony's family were notified, they were beyond broken by the terrible news. Even though her disappearance made no sense, they still hoped that they would see Sony again, no matter for what her reasons for leaving like that might have been. But now they knew that their darkest thoughts and suspicions came true. Sony would never come back home again, and her children lost their mother forever. What the authorities had to do now was figure out what had actually happened to Sony. The room was cleaned multiple times, even though everybody would agree that it could not have been very thorough. I come from a family where we ran a small hotel for almost 3 decades, and so the thought of not cleaning out rooms properly after every visit just seems completely outrageous to me. Especially the beds, like we all know how easy it is for things to get knocked underneath them, and also how much dust collects in there, so the bed is always where we would start first. I get that these motels are probably not the cleanest of places in the world, but equally you're running a business where people stay overnight, so I would expect a lot more care. Also, let's not forget that the investigators had already inspected the room when Sony went missing in the first place, so I wonder if they too just never thought of looking underneath the bed. Again, to me that would be the first place I would be searching, like a piece of evidence could have been left in there. And now to everyone it was pretty obvious that something was indeed left in there, just not the thing that anyone was expecting. It is also worth mentioning that since Sony had gone missing, the room was rented out 5 different times, and so in terms of any potential DNA evidence left on the scene, there was just no chance of ever finding that. So the investigators had to start from scratch with no clues whatsoever. And so they started by interviewing Sony's family. They quickly learned about Sony's exploding boyfriend Moody. Multiple people also came forward to say that Moody had in fact been violent towards Sony, and that she had mentioned on a few occasions that if something ever happened to her, it would definitely be Moody's doing. The investigators quickly marked Moody as their prime suspect and went on to look for him, but to their surprise, Moody had actually already been detained on a weapons charge. And so they quickly located him and started questioning him. But Moody was not budging, and he kept saying that he had nothing to do with his girlfriend's disappearance and murder. But with no evidence, there was very little that the police could do with Moody at the time. They didn't believe for a second that he had no involvement in Sony's murder, but equally they had nothing on Moody to say otherwise, and so they had to let him go for the time being. What everyone could agree on was the fact that Moody didn't seem too upset with the fact that the mother of his 4 children had been found deceased, especially under such horrible circumstances. To them, Moody just seemed cold with very little interest in the news. He also never explained as to why he not once contacted anyone about seeing his children, so that didn't sit well with the investigators either. With no concrete evidence, the authorities decided to look into Sony's belongings that were now with her sister Linda. They combed through everything, but nothing was really standing out to them. Sony's ID, wallet, and other personal items were there, but there were a couple of things that Sony's sister Linda had not been able to find. That was Sony's car and its car keys, and Sony's EBT card. EBT card, which stands for Electronic Benefit Transfer, is issued to people on benefits in the United States, where the state welfare department deposits the money, and so it sort of works like your normal debit card. And because Sony was on these benefits, she would have had an EBT card, and most likely she would always have it on her person to be able to make purchases with it. And so with that item missing, the authorities decided to have a look into Sony's banking history and see if this card was ever used after the day Sony went missing. And to their surprise, it was. The records showed that the EBT card was used on the 1st of February, so as soon as it would have been replenished by the state welfare department. Now, this could have meant 2 things. Either Sony was still alive at that point and she used it herself, or someone else did. The investigators drove over to the place where it was used last, and this turned out to be a small convenience shop called Panios Tony Care. The shop's owner, known as Tony, surprised the investigators by saying that he did remember the February 1st, and added that there were 16 surveillance cameras fitted throughout the shop, and so the police were welcome to review them and lift as much information as they needed. The investigators wasted no time and began doing exactly that. And this is exactly what would help them to break the case wide open. And soon enough, everybody would know what happened to Sony. When the investigators were looking at the tape, at first nothing was really jumping out at them. But then at around 8 AM on the 1st of February, a car that was identified to be Sony's missing car was seen being parked right in front of the shop. A second later, a man wearing a bright yellow t-shirt and baggy jeans stepped out. He then continued on to enter the store, and with Sony's EBT card, purchased a bottle of orange juice, withdrew $185, and then bought a cigarillo, which is something like a mini cigar. And that man in yellow t-shirt was no other than Sony's boyfriend, Lakeith Moody. This was exactly the type of evidence the investigators needed, and so they immediately arrested Moody. But Moody was still not budging. He continued on to say that he had done nothing wrong, and that the tape did not prove anything. But the coroner's office would soon reveal one important piece of information, and that was the actual cause of Sony's death. And so with all of this information in place, this is what the police believes happened to Sony on January 27, 2010. After Sony dropped her children off, for an unknown reason, she decided to stop over at a motel, and that is exactly where she was reported to be seen last. There, she ran into Moody, and the pair got into yet another heated argument. This was most likely about the fact that Moody was doing nothing to help her with the children, and at some point, Moody just snapped. He violently grabbed Sony and pulled her towards him, and then he wrapped his fingers around her neck and started squeezing. Sony did put up a fight, but Moody was just so much stronger and taller than her, so she stood no chance. After a few moments of struggle, Sony's eyes went wide as she could not take another breath. And so the mother of 5 would die in the hands of a man who was supposed to love and protect her. And this is exactly what the autopsy revealed, and so there was no questions that Sony had not been murdered. As Sony's body went limp, Moody quickly grabbed her and positioned her onto one of the beds. He then removed another bed's mattress and its slats, and with the steel frame exposed, he placed Sony's body into it. He then replaced the slats and the mattress and just left Sony's body in there as if nothing happened. He then grabbed Sony's EBT card, which he knew would be refreshed in just a few days, and also Sony's car keys. He then drove off in Sony's car and not once looked back. 5 days later, Moody walked into the convenience store where he used that EBT card that would later get him caught. But it would not be until 47 days later when Sony's body was finally found in room 222, after yet another complaint about a full odor within the room. Even with this evidence in place, it would not be until 4 years later when the jury would finally announce their verdict. And so, in February 2014, Lakeith Moody was found guilty of first-degree murder and automatically sentenced to life in prison. Since the case's details went public, the people that stayed in the room 222 within the period of when Sony was still inside the bed all agree that it is extremely disturbing to think that they slept on top of decomposing body, not knowing what the sweet smell was actually coming from. Like I've already said, to me it's just mind-blowing how you don't discover something like this the moment you come clean the room. So I completely get their worries. I also can't imagine how hard it must have been for the family to hear the news and what they must have thought of the whole scenario. This is definitely one of those cases where the more details you know, the more you wish you just didn't. And equally Moody must be one cold-hearted individual if he is capable of doing something like this and then going on about his life very nonchalantly, as if nothing had ever happened. I just hope that Sony's family can heal from all of this and her kids will be able to find happiness in whatever they choose to do. Let me know your thoughts about all of this, and I'll see you in the next one. Until next time.